Friends, I am so delighted to be with you here today. We're going to do a couple of things in this first part, and it's going to take kind of a shape of a little bit of history, a little bit of spiritual practices, a little bit of understanding where we've been and where we might go, especially understanding the role of sacred femininity within religion, but then also how we can learn from those things to have spiritual practices for our life now. So to do that, I'm going to just basically start by giving us a brief introduction of the entire history of women in Western Christianity up until this point. Does that sound fine? Sound good? We can do that in a few minutes. We have a fascinating journey because I think typically we look at religion and we see the patriarchal structure that's a part of it, and we think to ourselves, it must have always been like that, or that must be the dominant story. In fact, when we really look at the roots of both religion and many of the spiritual practices that we enjoy today, we find that there's actually much more of a balance between masculine and feminine that is so much at the root of it. And it's more of a modern invention that we have stopped seeing that as a part of practicing spirituality, right? And at its heart, religion, which is why we're starting with that in any way, is because it's a practice of the spirit. We are in a shift right now, and I'm sure many of us can feel it, where we're starting to finally look at Western Christianity and say, there are some things here we definitely love, there's some things here we need to shift pretty dramatically to reclaim some of that sacred feminine. And instead of thinking that we have none of it in our roots as our spiritual practices, we actually need to, I think, go back and reclaim some of these things so that we don't feel like we need to start from scratch. We don't feel like we actually have never had, those of us who are women, have never had a voice. It's just we need to be able to kind of reach back and say, what's part of the tradition that needs to be reclaimed? Part of this, I think we can go back to the last great Reformation that we had. And the church tends to work, religions in general, tend to work in 500-year cycles. Yeah, exactly. It takes a while for these things to change. It's really quite incredible when you go and you look at some of the research. Every 500 years, there's these major shifts where Christianity or other religions do exactly what we're looking at right now, where society kind of turns over on itself, and so does the soil of the major religions. Right? We start churning it up a little bit. 500 years ago, about give or take a couple years, was the Reformation, as an example, right? That was the last one that we had, one of these major shifts. And that was really alongside the shift of the Enlightenment, right? You know, this enlightened thinking, the time where academia and scientific thinking and empirical data became the currency of the day, right? And thank God for that. I don't know about you, I like modern medicine. I like being able to have electricity and things like that. But what it did do is it further stripped away the idea of the sacred feminine within religion, because they started to reclaim Aristotle and Plato and classic thinkers from the past who were very male-oriented. How male-oriented, you ask? I'm glad you did. Thank you for asking. That's great. They were so male-oriented that they actually, especially Aristotle, saw things as binaries. Right? There was only black and white, good or bad, male or female. Guess which one was not good? The feminine body. So much so that the feminine body was considered even lower on the scale, not just because it was feminine and thus weaker, but because it was more porous or leaky, Aristotle would say. Leaky. There were more fluids that left a woman. Truly, like I know, this is classic antiquity, folks. This is what they were talking about, right? And that seeped its way so much into institutional religion that any sort of the divine feminine that would have been there, things like Mary Magdalene, you know, seeing the divine saints who are women, that was even more systematically stripped right out of the religious canon. Do you see how much like the feminine body actually gets wrapped up in these spiritualities, such that When we are about to turn to what are some of the practices that we can glean from this, we have to make sure that we see our spirituality as both for us and for the moment we're living in, right? So what I mean by that is, if we're in the beginning of one of these 500-year shifts, it means the ground is very fertile for us to plant a spiritual seed into it. You might call it a womb space of time. And that particular type of womb space calls for people who are doing deep spiritual work, and again, not just for themselves, but because you know your spirituality is going to influence the next 500 years of spirituality. And it's quite clear we have a lot we need to reclaim and a lot we need to undo, so that the next 500 years won't feel the same oppression within our spiritual practices.